Our political commentators are with us now, and boy, what a week it has been. A very good morning to Peter Dunne and Tim Hurdle.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, Tim. Tim was an advisor in previous national governments. He works in strategic communication and advisory, and of course was also involved in the campaign, or he was campaign director for the recently elected Auckland Mayor Wayne Brown. Peter Dunne was the leader of United Future, a former MP and minister who has worked with both national and Labour-led governments. We go way back. You're a member of Labour originally, I think, too.
I was, yes.
All the way back.
10 years.
Yeah. All right. Look, what a week. Let's start with the police executive scandal, if we can call it that, but specifically the kind of political handling thereof. The IPCA report was as blunt as many journalists feel they have ever read. The announcement on stage in the Beehive with the Police Minister, Judith Collins, there also as Attorney General, I presume, and also Nicola Willis, very forthright in her responses as head of the public sector, of course, Minister responsible for the public sector. Tim, what do you make of the political response to such a damning report about the leadership of our police force, the previous leadership?
Well, I think it's been a situation where everybody's been so shocked by it, they're trying to distance themselves from it. I notice the Labour Party are very quiet, and it's probably because Chris Hipkins was Prime Minister in the time that he was the two deputy commissioners were appointed as statutory police, so they won't want to touch the issue. The existing government is trying to draw distance between the allegations of the emails, the commentary that the emails were diverted, and this is such a high-level scandal that probably reaches further than the police. I'm not sure that there won't be further political ramifications. I don't think this is the end of it. I think there's going to have to be some considerable soul-searching about, for example, how the security clearances were put through for these people when this was clearly an issue that was live, and with the PSC service, when system of appointments where people were getting appointed to jobs with these kind of allegations sitting around in the background. So I think the political ramifications could roll on from here. I think the administrative piece is probably rolled out now, but it's the politics that are going to play out from here.
Well, everyone seems to be saying they trusted what the other people told them, and that's kind of the problem. It's been shown.
That's the classic New Zealand, he's a good guy. He must be fine. I'm sure it's all okay. And no one ever goes back and says, right, okay, how do we actually see the paperwork to see that this is correctly being done? And this is where we end up. And this is what I mean about the wider implications for the system, where people are going to have to start being a bit more documented in their evidence when they just accept allegations or assertions that people are okay without actually viewing the paperwork themselves.
Public Service Commission, I think, involved in one of the two appointments that were in play of Jevon McSkimming during the time of all this, again saying we trusted what the information police gave us. Peter, former minister.
Yeah, I think there are two aspects to this. I mean, I think one of the things that's been exposed is the whole police culture, and there's a massive job correcting that, and it goes beyond the personalities. I think that this is much more deep-seated within that particular organisation, and so the restoration of public confidence and the change in culture is going to be a massive job. But I think the second point goes to something that Tim just said. We've got a group of individuals here who acted in a way that was clearly inappropriate, part of that driven by the culture of the organisation. But I've been thinking a lot over the last few days about in what other areas of government could the same sorts of things be occurring. And I think there's a bigger job for the Public Service Commission now, right across the machinery of government, to make sure that the sorts of practices that became prevalent during that era in the police aren't being replicated elsewhere. And, that I think is quite a serious...
This is at leadership level. This is the thing, because 2007 you had the Baisley report, and again the culture was to change, and that was decisions made and, frankly, cover-ups made in one case at a lower level of police leadership. The culture we know is an issue, and that there is an element of we are a team, you support the team, you don't question the team leadership. There's an element of that. Certain police officers did, but it was not sufficiently entrenched in practice all the way up to, and the most egregious actions highlighted here, apart from McSkimming's himself, was the police executive response.
Yeah, and that's my point about that wider cultural environment. Part of it will be the team nature of the way the police operate, but I think there's the potential.
It's elsewhere.
There's
in
a
the
lot
public
of those
service.
characteristics
You don't
could
rock the
take
boat.
Exactly, and
You don't hurt your own progression chances.
Yes, I mean, it used to be in the days before the state sector reforms that there was quite a rigid process. I'm not suggesting we go back to that, where you had the stud book and you could work out who was where.
The stud book?
That showed you where everyone's rankings occupation-wise within government, so you could work out that he's only at that level or she's only at that level, so how come they're getting this job? Now, that's all gone, and I'm not suggesting we go back to it, but I think what's coming into it in its place is that was quite a rigid, systemised approach. Now, because it's much more, theoretically at least, merit-based, it lends itself open to shoulder tapping, to mates' jobs, all that sorts of thing. And I think that what this incident has exposed is the potential prevalence of that right across the public sector.
Final thoughts, David. Final thoughts, Tim.
Yeah, and I think that Peter's right on the money there, because some of the reporting in the IPCA report talks about various PSC processes where they're looking at conflicting views. There is no evidence base to go back to say, well, this is why that decision was made. It wasn't written up in a transparent way, and that lends itself to the point that Peter's making of this perception that it's, we'll decide who it is and we'll kind of let it go, and without having any of that rigor in the process and evaluation of the information that should be truly vetted.
Te Pāti Māori's situation continues to worsen from its perspective. It now looks like there's 3 MPs. Well, it's split down the middle, essentially, Peter. 2 of them are now independents, a third apparently allied with them. The ones who are now independents and the third who's allied with them, wanting time in front of the council. I mean, first, let's just talk about where this is heading for this party, and then second, we'll talk about what the broader implications are ahead of next year's election.
Well, in terms of the first question, it's very hard to see Te Pāti Māori surviving in its present form. It's torn right down the middle. You've got very strong personalities on either side. You've got this peculiar dynamic of the Tamaheri connection right the way through. I can't see anything positive emerging out of this. The next question that leads to is, so is Te Pāti Māori finished, or does it resurrect into some new organisation? It can't do that without involving the type of people that it's just expelled. And the wider question of political implications are, well, good news for Labour in one sense, but bad news in another, because to get to government, we always knew Labour had to have Te Pāti Māori and its support some way on side. Without Te Pāti Māori being the strong influence that it appeared likely to be, Labour now has to win all the Māori seats, plus pick up the party vote.
The party vote. And often there was a split vote.
And
Te Pāti Māori was holding the electorate seat, but the party vote was still being picked up by Labour.
Yeah, but it's got to get the lot to make sure it's got that same pathway to government. And I think that's going to be a more difficult task now, because if a new Māori political grouping emerges, that will simply confuse the picture even further.
How are you reading it, Tim?
Yeah, well, this isn't dissimilar to when we had Hone Harawira go out with his own party, and that was ultimately the undoing of the then Maori Party. The problem we have, the Maori Party will have now, is how do you bring these people into a unified position? I heard the Morning Report interview this morning, and it was clear that the, quote, rebel faction, or whatever you want to call them, don't see the ability to reconcile with the existing leadership. So that sort of suggests that the pathway for the party is coming to an end. And then you, as Peter says, well, how do you find an arrangement? Do they have a confederation or some sort of peace offering? But it means that the unity they got from being a united party and the ability to potentially be a bloc that could negotiate with other political parties will be a lot more challenging, so making them a lot weaker as a proposition. So there's some quite big political implications from this schism.
Depending on what happens with the election result, what I think is most weakened, I mean, some will say this will be the end of the party, but you just can't make pronouncements like that. That's at this stage, right? But where it was sitting before this, having just had a big win in the Tamaki Makaurau by-election, was in a position to argue for ministerial seats, right? Is this going to be a situation, if it is weakened or we've got a split lineup here, where that is going to be harder to negotiate, Tim? What Labour might need from whatever Māori party there is in government, there is in Parliament after the next election, what it might need is support on supply and confidence. Is it going to be a downside harder for anyone to argue they're entitled to ministerial seats, Tim?
Well, absolutely. When you walk into the coalition talks and say how many votes you can deliver, there's now going to be a question on whether those votes are there and whether you can actually whip them or provide that certainty around support, at which point you've got less to trade with. You're going to be a weaker force, and that will reduce your bargaining power. So this is quite crucial for the Maori Party now.
How do you read Labour's numbers as everyone tries to make sense of where this might or how this might impact the next election result, Tim?
I find trying to decipher how the Labour Party and the Maori Party manage the vote and the party vote in those electorates is always quite challenging, because you do have those split votes. I suspect that there's been quite a good amount of vote splitting, as is evidenced by the results. And I wouldn't be surprised if we do see independent Maori MPs in Maori electorates, but a strong vote for the Labour Party on the party vote. So I guess that's probably the most likely outcome. But unless the Maori Party or a new party can emerge that has some sort of alternative platform, I suspect that's probably what we're heading for.
Okay. Well, interestingly, two new polls hinted a shifting landscape, although they reached slightly different conclusions. But I think in both instances, the two biggest parties made a bit of ground. And in one of them anyway, we saw perhaps the immediate impact of Te Pāti Māori's latest ructions. I think that may have been taken around the time this was unfolding. What are you making of where things are heading here, Peter, with the two polls in particular? We've had this extraordinary prevalence of several smaller parties comfortably above the 5% threshold or near it all at once. Might we see a more typical return to the two bigger parties gaining a bigger share?
It's possible, but not in the way that we were used to previously. I think the minor parties have locked in a bigger percentage of the vote, even if it's diminished than previously. I think if you look at all the polls, and I've been doing a rolling average for some years, the reality is that on only two occasions this year, March and September, has the opposition bloc had the numbers to form a government. Even on the latest polls, when you factor them in, the current coalition is still ahead. Marginally, it's not in a winning position. Now, the contradiction to all of that is the Ipsos poll revelations from this morning.
Just out this morning, which is a different kind of survey.
Which rate the coalition very badly on 15 of the major 20 issues. So on the one hand, National, ACT and New Zealand First have more votes than Labour, the Greens and whatever
but
is
they're
there.
begrudgingly given.
Yeah. On the other hand, people don't think they're up to it.
Yeah.
Now, let me throw in a third factor, which is another poll out this morning, which the New Zealand Herald is reporting. The country split down the middle on a capital gains tax. Most interestingly, the biggest opposition to it in Auckland. Where will the election be decided? Auckland. So put all that into the mix and try and work out what it means. Who knows?
How are you reading the variety of surveys, and particularly the latest two polls out? Again, as we said, they don't completely agree. One has Labour much further ahead of National than the other. But how are you reading the movement we're seeing, Tim?
Well, I think the Ipsos poll was, I'm going to throw another poll in the mix. The freshwater poll that I was involved in last month had a very similar sort of testing of people's views of the economy and their confidence in the government to deliver on those key policy issues. And the current government is really struggling on confidence in its economic management, and particularly managing the cost of living crisis. And I think those are very much then reflected in the party vote situations. The flip side of that is the numbers. You can over-interpret the shifts up and down for Labour and National, because I think they're running around with a degree of volatility that is kind of suggests to me the support for both parties is quite soft. Labor Party's gone up because it's been visible in a way it hasn't been for a long time, and is seen to at least offer something. I think there's quite a dissatisfaction across voter bases completely. And I think the other thing, and to Peter's point about forming a government, when you actually spend a bit of time studying the numbers, you realise there's some quite massive implications around overhang and those numbers of Parliament, which make determining who will actually be able to have the majority is quite unclear from the way that those blocks are lined up. So you've got some really volatile numbers that this far out, 12 months out from election now, we really will be probably coming to a situation where, unless the economy recovers, it's going to be a total cliffhanger.
And yet, if you go back and say, let's look at the same situation 3 years ago, 3 years ago, the lead for the then opposition was far clearer than the situation today. Maybe irrelevant, but maybe a pointer.
I mean, the right track, wrong track is the other one that's always looked to, because it tends to lead what happens with party vote support. But when you look at that Ipsos survey, again, a different kind of survey, the overall approval for the government, what was it, 3 point something, I think. Yeah, so that shows its issue. Labor, therefore, might be wanting to think it was heading even further ahead. It will certainly be very happy with the poll that had as high as 38%, although National also gained in that poll. The word you're using is volatility is very relevant.
Yeah.
Sim.
I think they should be, and Peter pointed out that capital gains tax poll this morning. If I was the Labor Party strategist, I'd be a bit concerned about that, because that's in the fresh light of day. They've put that policy up and it's not been subject to attack. It sort of suggests to me that it hasn't got the support that often people are claiming that everybody wants a capital gains tax. Seems to be the mantra these days, but it shows to me there is a lot of softness and support for that policy, and it really will come under quite heavy challenge.
Well, especially if it's in Auckland.
They've got a big problem. Selling a tax is really, really difficult. Auckland is a different... you just need to look at the demographics in Auckland and the voter stats there. That's where Labor got absolutely smashed at the last election, and this is going to be an impediment to them regaining that vote. All those seats that they lost out, the likes of Mount Roskill, which you'd never think would go Labor, they've got a problem there.
Now, the asset sales, Mr. Peters, this time last week, I think, on Monday morning, it's just such an enormous week. There's so many things that happened. Really using some quite strong language with... No, it was this time last week that Prime Minister Luxon, on Morning Report, possibly Monday or Tuesday, was starting to talk about asset sales, and he actually used the word asset sales as opposed to asset recycling, which is the new kind of word to use. Mr. Peters, New Zealand First Leader and part of the coalition, comes out very strongly with some quite strong language of it. Not on my watch appears to amount to it, but then also bizarrely said the government hadn't solved the country's economic problems. Are we starting to see this, and there will be more to follow, an issue that will see Mr. Peters and New Zealand First coming into campaign mode sooner rather than later, Peter?
Well, I think they've been in campaign mode since he stepped down as Deputy Prime Minister about 6 months ago. And this is going to be continued right through next year. To me, two things that were interesting about this. One is... whatever you think of asset sales as an issue, it's not popular with voters, and I was therefore surprised that the Prime Minister should lead with his chin on this one, because it's not actually an issue that's going to win him any votes, even if it might make sense economically. The second issue is, going back to our previous discussion, is this a little bit of positioning by New Zealand First, having previously ruled out working with not Labour, but with a Hipkins Labour Party, just to put themselves back in the frame, given the ructions within Te Pāti Māori saying, hey, if you're uncertain about your numbers, here's another little option out there that might just be valuable to you come election time.
I saw some speculation along those lines at the weekend too. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, well, Winston Peters is always very good at reading the wind, and I suspect drifting a little bit to the left and seeing what he can soak up will be his mind. I think the asset sales debate, I was kind of surprised almost how it was framed, because the days of being able to sell assets are quite challenged because there's just not a lot to sell. Landcorp, you've got all these treaty claims against it. I'm not sure how you'd ever sell Transpower, which is some of the things, I saw both those listed. So you really come down to shares in the electricity sector. That's a big enough political hand grenade without throwing in the concept of privatisation of those assets. So I was a wee bit surprised that it almost came up, but I guess it's the nature of the fiscal situation and trying to have a pathway towards surplus.
But talking about selling assets is pretty brutal. Had you framed it as sort of people's capitalism, we're going to sell shares in these entities, like we did a decade ago.
Well, some of the super funds are saying, give it to us, give it to us.
You could have framed a better argument about it than just simply let's open up the whole issue of asset sales again, because people inherently react against that.
All right. Very interesting.
I think that's right.
Yeah, very interesting to see. In the House, this is Vernon Small noting this, Mr. Peters, for no other reason, deciding to move government procedural motions in the form of we move rather than I move, and interpreting whether that was reinforcing the fact, of course, that it is shared sort of coalition policy. However, the point is Cabinet collective responsibility covers that off anyway. All right, let's see where it goes. Government backing down perceived as over some aspects of the Police Gun Register Seeing Act. Invoke again the agree to disagree. Any significance here, Tim, in terms of what's happened with that policy?
Not substantially, I don't think. I think the original reforms were probably done quite quickly, so there probably was a need to have in the cold light of day reform, probably given the nature of the minister that was in charge of it, was always going to be quite a leaning on towards the counterweight to what was done. But like all good government processes, once it gets pushed through, people get to sort out what's a reasonable process.
Yeah, I think that Tim is right. I think the issue of Nicole McKee's sort of predilections was relevant. I think that the slightly softer tone than many people were expecting is a bit of government compromise, but it's probably also a recognition that the hardline approach that ACT was taking wasn't going to win public credibility. So, issues like the military-style assault rifles, I think the fact that ban still remains is important. A lot of this is procedural tidying up, given that the way in which the policy emerged in the first place was very much reactive to the events in Christchurch all those years ago. So this is, I think, just rebalancing the pendulum a little bit. The
police register scene has been the biggest move. Just finally on climate policy, and we will return to this in more detail, I'm sure, next week with the climate minister due to go to the second week of the COP30 in Brazil. I sent you the article, Mark Daldra's comprehensive article on the number of policy changes in this area this year, most of them perceived as backtracks or watering downs or whatever phrase you want to use. What's going on here? Peter, how are you reading the approach this government is taking?
Well, I think you've got to look at it in terms of the approach that other governments are taking, and similar sorts of moves are being contemplated in other countries. I think that the enthusiasm of the earlier COP meetings is just being watered down by a sense of economic reality and just the sheer difficulty of making change. So I think we're sort of reflecting that. The difficulty, again, is how do you sell that change as being in line with the sort of the mainstream and not look like you're trying to opt out of your obligations and responsibilities. And I think I don't think they've done a good job in sort of presenting the case, even if they're following the line of others. Are they even trying to make the case for this, or are they simply making changes that will reduce the impacts of the Paris commitments on domestic policy? The delinking, for example, of needing to have certain policies from the international obligations, a clear move to give them more flexibility. Are they even trying to sell it or just doing it?
I think they're just doing. I think you're right. I think as Peter says, the international debate is quite brutal on this. Australia is running all their news channels are constantly talking about this stuff, and I think it's probably a reality of trying to just make some changes to give themselves some room. As the Americans pulled back from Paris, even I think quietly the Europeans have backed off a bit. It's kind of hard to stay too far out there. And New Zealand had put itself very much as our classic New Zealand way is at the vanguard, and now with things falling away, New Zealand has to kind of tidy up its sale.
Final thought, Peter, from you. Sir Geoffrey Palmer, he of Unbridled Proud, written 1980s, wasn't it?
Yes.
1990s, before the Select Committee again, criticising the speed of lawmaking, and there is absolutely no question the speed of it happening at the moment, the truncating of Select Committees, doing consultations with targeted parties, even the sheer volume of change to get through before Christmas. This is speed. Is speed tantamount to good lawmaking?
No, it's not. In fact, there's always the sort of rush in now, repent at leisure type approach. I think Sir Geoffrey makes some valid points. Having said that, it takes normally about 6 months from its conception to its passage to get a bill through Parliament, so some would argue that process is too long, but then you've got to allow for the debates, you've got to allow for the Select Committee process, you've got to allow for the officials' work. I think in terms of the government's pre-Christmas agenda, I was doing some work with local government last week, and a government minister came on and said, you're in the eye of the storm at the moment, there's a tsunami coming before Christmas. It's important to realise that will be legislation that will be introduced, so it can be sent to a Select Committee over the Christmas period. It's not going to all be passed before Christmas. But
I think the fast-track amendments are definitely
and the targeted
Yeah.
consultation and the limited Select Committee periods that we seem to be getting more and more of these days, I think are a worry, because it's that Select Committee process that usually highlights the bugs of legislation.
It often fixes
and if
the
you
bad stuff.
If you truncate that, you sort of fall back on having to do it again next year.
Yeah. Tim, comment?
I think it's also a reflection of the fact how many Select Committee processes are now getting swamped by AI-generated submissions, and the volume of information comes through, and trying to find a way to deal with the fact that now, I agree with Peter, generally in the good old days, effective consultation gave you some good ideas, but now we're just getting swamped and bombarded with submissions that are often not adding any value.
Well, if you gave people longer than 10 minutes, the bot's not going to turn up and do the in-person presentation, presumably, is it? Or in some
they can now.
Part of the problem, though, and can I just make this point?
Yeah.
I think a lot of witnesses to Select Committees, private citizens, corporates, organisations, don't actually understand the process. The Select Committee's there to ask questions about your views. People feel that they go in and sort of read their submission. Well, if they've only got 10 or 15 minutes, that's a waste of time. You've got to assume the committee's read it, and you need to be open to answer their questions. So I think the process can work much better if people actually understand what the process is.
Thanks, both of you. Much appreciated. Peter Dunne and Tim Hurdle.